The morning sun cast long shadows across Fort Braxton's main courtyard as General Marcus Steele adjusted his uniform and checked his reflection in the mirror one final time. At 52, he commanded respect through a combination of military achievement and barely controlled intimidation. His chest bore the weight of 30 years of service ribbons, each one a testament to his climb through the ranks of the Navy SEALs and eventually to his current position overseeing special operations training. Steele had built his reputation on being the hardest man in any room, the one who never backed down, never showed weakness, and never apologized for doing whatever it took to maintain order. His philosophy was simple. Respect came through strength, and strength was demonstrated through the willingness to use it. This morning would test that philosophy in ways he never anticipated. The briefing room was already filled with junior officers when Steele entered, his boots hitting the polished floor with the deliberate rhythm of a man accustomed to having others step aside. The morning's agenda included routine operational updates, personnel reviews, and the introduction of a new liaison officer from an undisclosed special operations unit. Standard procedure, nothing that should have raised any red flags. Sarah Chun stood quietly near the back wall, her posture relaxed but alert in the way that only comes from years of training most people couldn't imagine. To everyone in the room, she appeared to be just another mid-level officer, perhaps in her early 30s, with the kind of unremarkable presence that allowed her to blend into any military environment. Her personnel file, the one that everyone had access to, listed her as Lieutenant Sarah Chun, a communications specialist with deployment experience in Afghanistan and Iraq. What the file didn't mention, what even General Steele's security clearance couldn't access, was that Sarah Chun was one of only 12 operatives in a program so classified that its existence was known to fewer than 30 people in the entire government. The Phantom Protocol had been developing deep cover operatives for the past 8 years, creating soldiers who could function as ordinary military personnel while possessing capabilities that bordered on the supernatural. Sarah had been recruited at 19 after demonstrating exceptional aptitude in both physical combat and psychological resilience during her initial military training. For the past 12 years, she had undergone conditioning that included advanced combat techniques from 6 different martial arts traditions, weapons training with every conceivable firearm, and edged weapon, psychological conditioning to maintain cover under extreme stress, and physical enhancement through training regimens that pushed human capability to its absolute limits. Her current assignment was routine surveillance, monitoring for potential security breaches in special operations units. It was supposed to be a quiet posting, a chance to observe and report without engaging. Nobody expected trouble from a personnel review meeting at a domestic training facility. The meeting progressed normally for the first 20 minutes. Officers delivered their reports, Steele asked his usual pointed questions, and the administrative machinery of military bureaucracy ground forward with practiced efficiency. Sarah remained in her position against the wall, taking mental notes on security protocols and personnel interactions, exactly as her training demanded. The shift in atmosphere was subtle at first. Steele's questions became more aggressive, his tone sharper when he didn't like the answers he was hearing. A young lieutenant had made the mistake of suggesting that training protocols might benefit from updating to reflect lessons learned from recent field operations. To Steele, this sounded like criticism of methods he had personally implemented. Lieutenant Morrison, Steele's voice cut through the room like a blade. Are you suggesting that 30 years of proven techniques need modification because you've read some reports? The room fell silent. Everyone present recognized the danger signs. Steele's jaw had tightened, his hands had moved to rest on the table in front of him, and his eyes had taken on the flat, predatory look that preceded what everyone privately called correction sessions. Morrison, to his credit, tried to maintain his position respectfully. General, I'm simply noting that adaptive training has shown positive results in other units. And other units. Steele stood slowly, his chair scraping against the floor with deliberate menace. Lieutenant, do you know what makes this unit different from other units? The question hung in the air like a threat. Morrison swallowed hard before answering. Sir, I believe it's our commitment to excellence and proven methodologies. Wrong. Steele began walking around the table, each step measured and purposeful. What makes this unit different is that we understand that some lessons are learned through experience, not committee reports. Some truths are communicated through action, not discussion. Sarah watched the interaction with professional interest. Her training included extensive study of personality types and behavioral patterns, particularly those that indicated potential security risks. Steele was displaying classic signs of someone whose authority was built on intimidation rather than competence, someone who responded to perceived challenges with escalation rather than evaluation. The situation deteriorated rapidly. Steele continued his slow circuit of the room, delivering a lecture on respect, hierarchy, and the importance of unquestioning obedience that grew more personal and more threatening with each sentence. Morrison had gone pale, but was holding his ground, a decision that was clearly infuriating the general. "Perhaps," Steele said, stopping directly behind Morrison's chair, "you need a more direct demonstration of how authority works in this unit." Sarah saw the general's hand move before anyone else in the room registered the motion. Years of training had given her the ability to read microexpressions and anticipate violent actions before they fully developed. Steele was going to strike Morrison, probably a blow to the back of the head designed to humiliate rather than seriously injure, but a clear violation of military protocol nonetheless. She was calculating whether intervention was warranted when the situation took an unexpected turn. Morrison, perhaps sensing the threat, began to turn in his chair. The movement caused Steele to adjust his intended target, and suddenly his open hand was moving towards Sarah's direction. The slap was intended for Morrison's face, but caught Sarah across the left cheek with surprising force. The sound echoed through the suddenly silent room like a gunshot. For a moment, nobody moved. Steele stood frozen, his hand still extended, apparently shocked by his own action. Morrison remained half-turned in his chair, eyes wide with disbelief. The other officers sat motionless, uncertain whether they had just witnessed a career-ending moment for their commanding officer. Sarah touched her cheek gently, feeling the sting of the blow and the slight swelling that was already beginning. Her expression remained completely neutral, but something had shifted in her posture. The relaxed alertness was gone, replaced by something that would have been recognizable to anyone who had ever seen a predator preparing to strike. "General Steele," she said quietly, her voice carrying clearly through the silent room, "I think there's been a misunderstanding." Steele, perhaps recognizing that he had just made a serious error in judgment, attempted to reassert control through aggression. It was a response pattern Sarah had seen dozens of times in her career, the moment when someone realizes they've made a mistake and chooses to double down rather than admit fault. "There's no misunderstanding, Lieutenant," he snapped, his voice rising to fill the room. "You're all going to learn the same lesson today. Respect isn't requested in this unit, it's demanded. And when respect isn't shown, there are consequences." He stepped closer to Sarah, close enough that she could smell his cologne and see the small scar on his left temple that spoke of some long-ago violence. His eyes held the confidence of a man who had never encountered serious resistance to his authority, who had built a career on the assumption that his willingness to use force would always exceed that of anyone who might oppose him. "Do you understand, Lieutenant Chun?" Sarah looked up at him with eyes that seemed to see right through his carefully constructed facade. When she spoke, her voice was calm, almost conversational, but there was something underneath it that made several of the officers unconsciously lean away from her. "I understand completely, General. The question is whether you understand what just happened." The words were spoken so quietly that Steele had to strain to hear them, which meant he was leaning forward, off balance, when Sarah moved. The transition from apparent compliance to deadly action took less than 2 seconds. Sarah's right hand came up in a movement so fast it seemed to blur, catching Steele's extended wrist and applying pressure to a nerve cluster that sent immediate, excruciating pain shooting up his arm. Simultaneously, her left hand struck a precise point on his solar plexus, not hard enough to cause permanent damage, but with enough accuracy to temporarily disrupt his breathing. Steele staggered backward, his arm going numb from the nerve strike, his vision blurring as his body struggled to process what had just happened. He tried to speak, but could only produce a strangled wheeze as his diaphragm spasmed. The entire room erupted in shocked motion. Officers jumped to their feet, some reaching for sidearms, others simply backing away from what they couldn't understand. Sarah remained exactly where she had been, her hands now clasped behind her back in a position of military attention, her expression as neutral as if nothing had happened. "Security!" someone shouted, though nobody seemed certain who should be detained. Sarah addressed the room in the same calm, clear voice she had used moments before. "General Steele has just experienced a mild neurological reaction to stress. He'll recover completely in about 90 seconds. I recommend he sit down and focus on breathing normally." Steele, still gasping and struggling to understand how a simple personnel meeting had turned into a physical altercation he was losing, managed to focus his eyes on Sarah's face. What he saw there made his blood run cold. There was no anger, no fear, no satisfaction. There was only the cool, professional assessment of someone who had just demonstrated a fraction of her capabilities and was calmly evaluating whether further action was necessary. "Who?" he wheezed, finally, managing to force words through his recovering vocal cords. "Who are you?" Sarah tilted her head slightly, as if considering how to answer a question that was more complicated than it appeared. "That's an excellent question, General. I think it's time you learned the answer." The room fell silent again, but this time the silence felt different. It wasn't the shocked stillness that had followed the general's assault, but the tense quiet that comes when everyone senses that something significant is about to be revealed, something that will change the fundamental understanding of everything they thought they knew. Sarah reached slowly into her jacket pocket, her movements deliberate and visible to demonstrate that she posed no threat to anyone who didn't threaten her first. She withdrew a small leather wallet and opened it to reveal credentials that made Steele's face go ashen white. "My name is Agent Sarah Chun, and I'm operating under the authority of Operation Phantom Protocol. General Steele, you have just assaulted a federal agent in the performance of her duties. Under normal circumstances, this would result in your immediate arrest and court-martial." She closed the wallet and returned it to her pocket, her eyes never leaving Steele's face. "However, these are not normal circumstances. I'm prepared to discuss alternative resolutions to this situation, depending on your willingness to listen and your understanding of what just became possible." The general straightened slowly, his hands still numb, but his breathing returning to normal. The pain in his chest was fading, but the pain to his pride and his understanding of his own authority was just beginning. He had built his entire career on being the most dangerous person in any room, and in the space of 2 seconds, a woman he had dismissed as insignificant had demonstrated that everything he believed about power and control was an illusion. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah smiled for the first time since entering the room, and somehow that expression was more unsettling than anything that had come before. "I want you to sit down, General. We need to talk, and you're going to want to be comfortable for this conversation." As Steele sank into the nearest chair, his mind racing to understand how his routine morning had turned into what felt like the most important conversation of his military career, Sarah turned to address the other officers in the room. "Gentlemen, what you witnessed here today is classified beyond your clearance levels. You will not discuss it with anyone, you will not include it in any reports, and you will not speculate about its implications. Is that understood?" The chorus of "Yes, ma'am" that echoed through the room carried a respect that General Steele had never heard directed toward anyone but himself. As Sarah began to explain exactly who she was and why she was there, Steele realized that his understanding of military hierarchy, federal authority, and his own place in the larger structure of national security was about to undergo a complete and permanent revision. The briefing room had been cleared of all personnel except General Steele, Agent Chun, and Colonel Davidson, the base's executive officer whose security clearance was sufficient to witness what was about to unfold. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, heavy with implications that none of them fully understood yet. Sarah had positioned herself across from Steele at the conference table, her posture relaxed but alert. The general sat stiffly in his chair, his pride warring with the growing realization that he was completely out of his depth. His left hand still tingled from the nerve strike, a constant reminder that the woman across from him possessed capabilities he couldn't begin to comprehend. Operation Phantom Protocol, Sarah began, her voice taking on the crisp tone of an official briefing, was established 8 years ago in response to emerging threats that conventional military and intelligence operations couldn't address effectively. The program identifies individuals with exceptional physical and psychological capabilities and develops them into deep cover operatives who can function within existing military and civilian structures while maintaining specialized mission readiness. She paused to let the implications sink in. General, your unit has been selected for enhanced oversight because intelligence suggests that advanced training methodologies being developed here may have applications for future Phantom operatives. My assignment was to observe and assess, not to engage. Steele's jaw worked silently for several seconds before he found his voice. You're telling me that you've been spying on my operation under the pretense of being a communications officer? I'm telling you that I've been conducting authorized surveillance as part of a national security initiative that operates at classification levels beyond your access, Sarah replied calmly. The pretense, as you call it, was necessary operational security. Colonel Davidson, who had remained silent since the room was cleared, finally spoke. Agent Shun, what General Steele did was inexcusable, but striking a superior officer is also a serious offense. How do we resolve this situation? Sarah turned her attention to Davidson, and the colonel found himself unconsciously straightening under her gaze. There was something about her eyes that suggested she was evaluating him in ways that went far beyond the surface interaction they were having. That depends entirely on General Steele's response to what I'm about to tell him, she said. The physical altercation was regrettable, but it's provided us with an opportunity to discuss some concerning observations that might otherwise have remained in classified reports. She opened a tablet that had appeared from somewhere in her jacket and began scrolling through what appeared to be extensive notes. General, your training methods show concerning patterns that suggest potential security vulnerabilities. Your reliance on intimidation and physical domination as motivational tools has created an environment where subordinates are afraid to report problems or suggest improvements. This isn't just bad leadership, it's a national security risk. Steele's face flushed red. My methods have produced some of the finest special operations personnel in the military. We have a 92% mission success rate and a 47% rate of psychological discharge within 2 years of graduation, Sarah interrupted, reading from her tablet, along with the highest rate of disciplinary problems among graduates of any special operations program. General, you're not creating elite soldiers, you're creating damaged ones. The words hit Steele like physical blows. His entire identity was built around his reputation as a trainer of elite warriors. The suggestion that his methods were not only flawed but actively harmful challenged everything he believed about himself and his career. You don't understand what it takes to forge soldiers who can operate in life-or-death situations, he said, his voice rising despite his efforts to maintain control. Comfort and understanding don't prepare men for combat. Hardship and discipline do. Sarah set down her tablet and leaned forward slightly. General, would you like to know what my training looked like? Something in her tone made both men focus their attention completely on her words. When she continued, her voice carried a matter-of-fact quality that somehow made the content even more disturbing. I was recruited at 19 and spent the next 3 years in a program that began each day at 4 a.m. with a 6-mile run carrying 40 pounds of equipment. Physical training included not just strength and endurance conditioning, but pain tolerance exercises that taught us to function normally while experiencing significant physical discomfort. We learned to dislocate our own joints to escape restraints, to slow our heart rates to mimic death, and to maintain operational effectiveness while suffering from sleep deprivation, hunger, and various forms of psychological pressure. She paused, noting the expressions of growing concern on both men's faces. Combat training covered everything from improvised weapons construction to advanced interrogation resistance. We learned to kill silently with household objects, to extract information from reluctant sources, and to maintain cover identities under circumstances that would break most people's psychological defenses. Davidson swallowed hard. How many people completed this program? Of the 43 candidates who began training with me, 12 graduated. Of those 12, I'm one of only 7 still operational. The others suffered various forms of physical or psychological breakdown that ended their careers. Steele stared at her with a mixture of horror and fascination. And you think this proves your training was superior to mine? Sarah's expression didn't change, but something in her voice shifted. General, the difference between your program and mine isn't the level of hardship or the intensity of training. It's that every single element of our conditioning was carefully designed by teams of psychologists, physicians, and experienced operators to push us to our limits without breaking us. Your methods push people past their breaking points and then punish them for breaking. She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the training grounds where young soldiers were going through their morning exercises. More importantly, my trainers never confused brutality with strength. They never used their authority to humiliate or degrade us. They understood that creating a warrior requires building someone up, not tearing them down. The silence that followed was broken by Steele's bitter laugh. So this is all about my leadership style? You engineered this entire confrontation to give me a lecture on proper training methods. Sarah turned back to face him, and for the first time since the incident began, her expression showed something approaching sympathy. General, I didn't engineer anything. You struck me because you were angry and you thought I was powerless to respond. Everything that followed was a direct result of your decision to use violence as a tool for maintaining control. She returned to her seat and opened her tablet again. However, you're right that this situation provides an opportunity for discussion. Operation Phantom Protocol is always looking for experienced trainers who understand the difference between developing warriors and creating victims. Your military record shows exceptional operational capabilities and strategic thinking. The question is whether you're capable of evolving your leadership approach to match your tactical skills. Steele's mind raced as he tried to process what she was suggesting. Are you offering me a position in your program? I'm offering you the chance to learn about training methods that actually produce the kind of soldiers you think you've been creating, Sarah replied. Whether that leads to a formal position depends on your willingness to acknowledge that your current approach needs fundamental changes. Colonel Davidson leaned forward. What exactly would this involve? Sarah consulted her tablet before responding. General Steele would undergo a comprehensive evaluation of his training methodologies, participate in observation sessions with actual Phantom Protocol instructors, and develop new curricula that incorporate proven psychological and physiological principles. If he demonstrates the ability to adapt his approach effectively, he could be considered for advanced clearance levels and potential involvement in program development. She looked directly at Steele. However, this opportunity comes with non-negotiable conditions. First, there will be no retaliation against any personnel who witness today's events. Second, you will implement immediate changes to eliminate intimidation and physical abuse from your training programs. Third, you will submit to psychological evaluation to ensure you can handle the stress of working with highly classified materials without compromising operational security. Steele felt the walls of his carefully constructed world shifting around him. Everything he had built his identity on was being challenged, but the alternative being offered represented access to knowledge and capabilities he had never imagined possible. And if I refuse? Sarah's expression became completely neutral again. Then, you will face formal charges for assaulting a federal agent. Your security clearance will be revoked, and your military career will end in disgrace. Additionally, Operation Phantom Protocol will recommend immediate restructuring of your training programs under new leadership. The choice was stark and immediate. Steele could maintain his pride and lose everything he had worked for, or he could admit that everything he believed about effective training was wrong and potentially gain access to opportunities beyond his current imagination. Colonel Davidson broke the tense silence. General, with respect, I think you should seriously consider Agent Chen's offer. What I witnessed today suggests that our understanding of advanced training methods might be more limited than we realized. Steele looked at Davidson, then at Sarah, then down at his hands. The left one was still slightly numb from the nerve strike, a constant reminder of how quickly and completely his assumptions about control and power had been shattered. "If I agree to this evaluation," he said slowly, "what guarantees do I have that this won't simply be an elaborate setup to destroy my career?" Sarah leaned back in her chair, and for the first time since the confrontation began, she smiled genuinely. "General, if I wanted to destroy your career, I would have simply filed my report and let the bureaucracy handle it. The fact that I'm sitting here offering you alternatives means that someone believes you have potential that's worth developing." She stood and moved toward the door. "Take the rest of the day to consider your options. I'll be on base until tomorrow evening. If you decide you're interested in learning what real elite training looks like, contact me through Colonel Davidson. If not, I'll file my report and you can deal with the consequences through normal military channels." As her hand touched the door handle, she turned back one final time. "General, you spent 30 years believing that strength came from being feared. I hope you'll consider the possibility that true strength comes from being respected. The choice is yours." After she left, Steele sat in silence for several minutes, his mind racing through the implications of everything that had happened. Davidson remained quietly in his chair, apparently unwilling to break the general's concentration. Finally, Steele spoke without looking up from his hands. "Davidson, in your honest opinion, how do our graduates compare to the personnel you've encountered from other elite units?" The colonel considered his response carefully. "Sir, our people are tough and disciplined, but they often struggle with adaptability and independent thinking. They're excellent at following orders, but not as strong at taking initiative when circumstances change." Steele nodded slowly. "And you think Agent Chin's approach might address those deficiencies?" "Sir, I think Agent Chin represents capabilities I didn't know existed. If her training program produced someone with her skills, then we need to understand how that was accomplished." Steele stood and walked to the window where Sarah had stood minutes before. The training grounds looked the same, but his perspective on what was happening there had changed completely. "Davidson, I need you to arrange a private meeting with Agent Chin this evening. And I want you to pull the psychological profiles on all our graduates from the past 3 years. It's time I took an honest look at what I've been creating." As Colonel Davidson left to make the arrangements, General Steele remained at the window, watching his soldiers train and wondering if everything he had built his life around was about to change forever. The morning had begun with him as the undisputed authority in his own domain. Now he found himself questioning not just his methods, but his entire understanding of what it meant to be a warrior. The woman who had walked out of his briefing room possessed skills that seemed almost superhuman, but more importantly, she possessed a confidence that didn't require intimidation or violence to maintain itself. For the first time in his career, Steele found himself wondering what it would be like to command that kind of respect rather than the fear-based obedience he had always relied on. The decision facing him wasn't just about his career, it was about his identity. He could cling to his old beliefs and face the consequences, or he could step into unknown territory and discover what he might be capable of becoming. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across the training grounds, Steele knew that whatever choice he made would define not just his future, but his understanding of what true strength really meant. The evening meeting was arranged in Steele's private office, a space that reflected 30 years of military achievement through carefully displayed commendations, unit photographs, and tactical memorabilia. Sarah arrived precisely at 1900 hours, her civilian clothes doing nothing to diminish the sense of controlled power that seemed to emanate from her presence. Steele had spent the afternoon reviewing personnel files and psychological evaluations from his training programs, and what he had discovered disturbed him more than he was willing to admit. The patterns Sarah had identified were undeniable once he forced himself to look at them objectively. His methods were producing soldiers who excelled in controlled environments, but struggled when forced to think independently or adapt to unexpected circumstances. "Thank you for coming, Agent Chun," he said, gesturing toward a chair across from his desk. "I've been reviewing the data you mentioned, and I have some questions." Sarah settled into the chair with the fluid grace that seemed to characterize all her movements. I'm here to answer any questions you have, General. But first, I think you should understand exactly what you're considering. She produced a different tablet from the one she had used earlier, this one clearly containing more sensitive information. Operation Phantom Protocol doesn't just train elite soldiers, General. We create individuals who can function as military personnel, intelligence operatives, diplomatic attaches, corporate executives, or any other role required for mission success. Our graduates don't just fight enemies. They become whoever they need to be to accomplish their objectives. Steele leaned forward, intrigued despite himself. You're talking about deep cover operatives with multiple skill sets. I'm talking about individuals who can spend 3 years as aid worker in Syria while secretly mapping terrorist networks, then transition seamlessly to working as a technology consultant in Silicon Valley while monitoring foreign intelligence activities, then deploy as a military advisor in Southeast Asia while conducting sensitive diplomatic negotiations. Sarah's voice carried the matter-of-fact tone of someone describing routine business operations. The psychological conditioning required to maintain multiple identities while performing at elite levels in completely different environments goes far beyond traditional military training. It requires building individuals who are simultaneously adaptable and unbreakable, creative and disciplined, independent and loyal. She paused to let the implications sink in. General, your current methods could never produce someone capable of that level of sophisticated operation. They're designed to create followers, not leaders. They emphasize conformity over adaptability. Most critically, they use fear and stress as motivational tools, which actually inhibits the kind of creative problem-solving that deep cover operations require. Steele absorbed this information while reviewing what he had learned about his own program's deficiencies. What would it take to restructure my approach to support these objectives? Sarah consulted her tablet before responding. Complete reconstruction of your psychological framework, integration of advanced training methodologies that most military personnel don't have clearance to access, and personal development that would challenge every assumption you currently hold about leadership and human motivation. She looked up from the screen to meet his eyes directly. General, you asked me what guarantees you would have that this process wouldn't be designed to destroy your career. Let me be completely honest with you. This process will destroy your career as you currently understand it. The question is whether you're willing to let it build something completely different in its place. The words hung in the air between them like a challenge. Steele had built his identity around being uncompromising, unbeatable, and unchanging. The prospect of fundamental personal transformation was both terrifying and strangely appealing. What would the evaluation process involve, he asked. Sarah smiled slightly, apparently recognizing his question as a sign of genuine interest rather than mere curiosity. Phase 1 would be psychological assessment to determine your baseline capabilities and identify areas that need development. This includes cognitive testing, stress response evaluation, adaptability measurements, and personality integration analysis. Phase 2 involves immersive training experiences designed to challenge your current assumptions about effective methodology. You would observe advanced training sessions, participate in scenario-based exercises, and work directly with experienced Phantom Protocol instructors to understand alternative approaches. She paused to gauge his reaction before continuing. Phase 3 requires you to develop and implement new training curricula for your own programs, with success measured by objective performance improvements in your graduates rather than subjective impressions of compliance. And if I succeed in all 3 phases, then you would be eligible for advancement to classified training levels that would give you access to techniques and technologies that most military personnel never learn exist. You would also be qualified to contribute to program development for future Phantom Protocol initiatives. Steele stood and walked to his display case, examining the medals and commendations that represented his life's achievements. Agent Chun, what you're describing sounds like science fiction. Human beings trained to that level of capability, operating with that degree of sophistication, it doesn't seem possible. General, Sarah's voice carried a note of amusement. Yesterday, would you have believed that a communications officer could disable you with precise nerve strikes? Would you have thought it possible for someone to maintain perfect emotional control while being physically assaulted by a superior officer. She stood and moved to join him at the display case. The limitations you perceive as absolute are actually just the boundaries of your current training and experience. The question isn't whether these capabilities are possible, but whether you're willing to expand your understanding of what human potential actually encompasses. As they stood side by side, examining his accumulated honors, Steele found himself reassessing not just the achievements themselves, but what they represented. Each medal told the story of a mission where he had relied on conventional training and traditional approaches to overcome challenges. Now he was being offered access to methodologies that might have made those same missions not just easier, but fundamentally different in their execution and outcomes. There's something else you need to understand, Sarah continued, her voice becoming more serious. If you enter this program, you'll be exposed to information that carries lifelong security obligations. You'll learn about capabilities and operations that you can never discuss with anyone who doesn't have appropriate clearance. You'll become part of a community that most people, including most military personnel, don't know exists. She turned to face him directly. This isn't just a career change, General. It's entry into a completely different world, with different rules, different responsibilities, and different standards for success. Once you cross that threshold, there's no going back to the simplicity of conventional military operations. Steele met her gaze and saw something there that he finally recognized. It wasn't just confidence or competence, though both were clearly present. It was the calm assurance of someone who had discovered capabilities within themselves that they never knew were possible, someone who had transcended their original limitations to become something fundamentally different from what they had started as. Agent Chun, he said quietly, when you were recruited for this program, what convinced you to accept? Sarah's expression softened slightly, showing the first trace of personal emotion he had seen from her. The recruiter asked me a simple question. Do you want to spend your life being limited by what you think is possible, or do you want to discover what you're actually capable of? I realized that everything I thought I knew about my own potential was just assumption based on limited experience. She moved back toward her chair, but didn't sit down. General, you've spent 30 years believing that you understood the extent of human capability because you had reached the limits of conventional training. Today you learned that those limits are much higher than you imagined. The question now is whether you want to continue operating within those old boundaries or discover what lies beyond them. Steele nodded slowly, beginning to understand the true scope of the decision he was facing. This wasn't about improving his training methods or advancing his career within the existing military structure. This was about stepping into a realm of human capability that he hadn't known existed, with all the responsibilities and isolation that such knowledge would bring. If I agree to this evaluation, he said, when would it begin? Phase 1 could begin tomorrow morning. I would need 3 days to conduct the psychological assessments and compile the baseline evaluations. Phase 2 would require travel to a classified facility for approximately 2 weeks of immersive training observation and participation. Phase 3 would be conducted here, with oversight from Phantom Protocol instructors, and could take anywhere from 6 months to 2 years depending on your adaptation rate and the complexity of the new curricula you develop. Sarah returned to her chair and opened her tablet again. However, before we proceed, I need to address the incident that brought us to this conversation. Your decision to strike a subordinate officer demonstrates exactly the kind of authority abuse that makes conventional military training ineffective for advanced operations. If you enter this program, that behavior pattern must be completely eliminated. Steele felt his jaw tighten as his old instincts toward defensive anger activated. But then he forced himself to consider her words objectively. The striking of Agent Chun had been a moment of lost control that had revealed weaknesses he didn't want to admit existed. You're saying that my use of intimidation and physical dominance actually demonstrates a lack of real authority, he said. I'm saying that true authority comes from competence, wisdom, and the ability to develop those qualities in others, Sarah replied. Fear-based compliance is not just ethically problematic, it's operationally ineffective. It creates followers who can't function independently when the authority figure isn't present to direct their actions. She closed the tablet and leaned back in her chair. General, in deep cover operations, our people often spend months or years operating completely independently, making critical decisions without any possibility of consulting with supervisors. They need to have internalized not just skills and procedures, but judgment, adaptability, and the confidence to act decisively in unprecedented situations. That kind of operational independence can't be developed in people who have been conditioned to wait for orders and fear making mistakes. The insight hit Steele with unexpected force. He had always believed that his strict discipline created stronger soldiers, but he was beginning to recognize that it might actually have created weaker ones. People who excelled at following orders, but struggled when forced to think for themselves. Agent Shun, I need to ask you something directly. When you struck back at me this morning, was that a calculated response or an instinctive one? Sarah smiled, apparently appreciating the perceptiveness of the question. It was both, General. My training included developing the ability to respond instantly and appropriately to unexpected threats, but also the judgment to calibrate that response to achieve optimal outcomes rather than simply neutralizing the threat. Optimal outcomes? If my objective had been simply to stop your attack, I could have done that in ways that would have permanently disabled you. If my objective had been to humiliate you in front of your subordinates, I could have done that as well. My actual objective was to create an opportunity for productive dialogue while demonstrating that your assumptions about power dynamics were flawed. The techniques I used were selected specifically to achieve those goals. Steele absorbed this explanation with growing amazement. The woman across from him had managed strategic thinking, tactical assessment, precise physical execution, and psychological manipulation simultaneously in the space of a few seconds. The level of integrated capability she represented was unlike anything he had encountered in 3 decades of military service. General, Sarah continued, the choice you're facing isn't really about career advancement or even personal development. It's about whether you want to continue operating at your current level of capability or discover what becomes possible when those capabilities are fundamentally expanded. She stood to leave, then paused at the door. I'll be in quarters 12B until tomorrow evening. If you decide to proceed with the evaluation, contact Colonel Davidson and he'll make the arrangements. If you decide that this opportunity isn't right for you, then we'll handle the morning's incident through normal military channels and I'll complete my original assignment. After she left, Steele sat alone in his office, surrounded by the accumulated symbols of his military achievements, and realized that everything they represented might be just the beginning of what was possible. The decision facing him would determine not just the direction of his career, but his understanding of human potential itself. As he sat there weighing his options, one thought kept returning to his mind. For the first time since his initial military training decades earlier, he was being offered the chance to discover that he was capable of more than he had ever imagined. The question was whether he had the courage to find out what that might mean. General Steele made his decision at 0430 hours, after a sleepless night spent wrestling with 30 years of accumulated beliefs about military leadership and human capability. By 0600, Colonel Davidson had arranged the initial meeting, and by 0800, Steele found himself in a converted conference room undergoing psychological evaluation procedures that were unlike anything he had experienced in his military career. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, the program psychologist who had arrived on base during the early morning hours, conducted assessments that went far beyond standard military psychological screening. Where conventional evaluations focused on stability and compliance, these tests measured adaptability, creative problem-solving under stress, and the ability to maintain multiple perspectives simultaneously. General Steele, Dr. Martinez explained as she reviewed his initial test results. Traditional military psychology aims to identify individuals who will function effectively within established hierarchical structures. Our evaluations assess potential for developing capabilities that transcend those structures entirely. The testing continued for 3 days, during which Steele experienced cognitive challenges that pushed his mental flexibility to limits he hadn't known existed. He was presented with scenarios that required him to adopt multiple contradictory perspectives, solve problems using unconventional approaches, and maintain emotional equilibrium while processing information that challenge his fundamental assumptions about reality. Sarah observed the evaluation sessions when her schedule permitted, taking notes that would inform decisions about Steele's potential advancement within a program. What she saw encouraged her. Despite decades of conditioning toward rigid thinking patterns, the general demonstrated remarkable adaptability when challenged to approach problems from new directions. His cognitive flexibility scores are higher than we typically see from conventional military personnel, Dr. Martinez reported to Sarah after the second day of testing. More importantly, his stress response pattern suggests that he can handle significant psychological pressure without losing operational effectiveness. What about his authority management issues? Sarah asked. Interesting development there. When presented with scenarios where traditional authority structures were ineffective, he adapted quickly to collaborative approaches. The intimidation patterns appear to be learned behaviors rather than fundamental personality traits. Sarah nodded, reviewing her own observations from the evaluation sessions. He's been operating within a system that rewarded those behaviors for so long that they became automatic responses. The question is whether he can develop new automatic responses that are more operationally effective. On the third day of evaluation, Dr. Martinez introduced Steele to training techniques that demonstrated the difference between conventional stress inoculation and advanced psychological conditioning. Instead of simply exposing him to difficult circumstances and expecting him to endure them, the new methodologies taught him to transform his relationship with stress itself. General, she explained as she guided him through breathing exercises that seemed deceptively simple. Conventional training teaches people to function despite stress. Advanced training teaches people to function because of stress, to use psychological pressure as an enhancement rather than an obstacle. Steele found the concept intellectually fascinating, but practically challenging. Decades of military conditioning had taught him to view stress as something to be overcome through discipline and willpower. The idea that stress could be transformed into a performance enhancement required completely different mental approaches. Dr. Martinez, what Agent Chen demonstrated during our initial encounter was that the result of this kind of conditioning, partly, Agent Chen's capabilities result from integrated training that includes physical techniques, psychological conditioning, and strategic thinking development. The physical skills are impressive, but the psychological foundations are what make them operationally useful. She continued the breathing exercise while explaining. When Agent Chen neutralized your attack, she wasn't just using physical techniques. She was simultaneously assessing the threat level, calculating optimal response strategies, managing her own stress response, evaluating the psychological impact on observers, and planning follow-up actions. All of this happened in less than 2 seconds. Steele tried to imagine the mental processing required for such integrated response capability. How long does it take to develop that level of cognitive integration? For most candidates, approximately 18 months of intensive conditioning. However, the timeline varies significantly based on the individual's baseline capabilities and adaptation rate. Dr. Martinez paused the exercise and consulted her evaluation notes. General, your preliminary results suggest that you have substantial potential for developing these capabilities, but there are some concerns that need to be addressed. She turned to face him directly. Your authority management patterns show deep conditioning toward dominance-based leadership. While this can be modified, the process will require you to confront some uncomfortable truths about the difference between respect and fear, between strength and control. Steele nodded grimly. The past 3 days had already begun forcing him to examine assumptions he had never questioned before. Dr. Martinez, if I continue with this program, what changes would be required in how I interact with subordinates? Fundamental changes, General. You would need to transition from authority based on rank and intimidation to authority based on competence and development of others. You would need to learn to lead through inspiration and expertise rather than fear and punishment. She opened her tablet to show him comparative data. Our analysis of your current training programs shows that graduates excel at following orders, but struggle with independent decision-making. They perform well in controlled environments, but have difficulty adapting to unexpected situations. These patterns are direct results of training methods that emphasize compliance over development. The data was undeniable, and Steele found himself confronting the reality that his leadership approach had been systematically undermining the very capabilities he thought he was developing. What would effective leadership look like in your operational environment? Dr. Martinez smiled. That's exactly the right question, General. Let me show you something. She led him to an observation room where they could watch Sarah conducting a training session with 3 junior operatives who had arrived on base the previous evening. What Steele observed challenged every assumption he held about military instruction. Sarah was guiding the operatives through a complex scenario involving multiple objectives, incomplete information, and time pressure. Instead of issuing orders or establishing rigid procedures, she was asking questions that forced the trainees to think through problems independently while providing guidance that helped them develop better analytical approaches. Notice how she never tells them what to do, Dr. Martinez pointed out. She helps them understand how to evaluate situations and make decisions, but the actual choices remain theirs. She's developing judgment rather than compliance. Steele watched as one of the trainees made a tactical error that would have resulted in mission failure. Instead of stopping the exercise and delivering correction, Sarah allowed the consequences to play out naturally, then guided the trainee through analysis of what had happened and why. Agent Chun, wouldn't direct correction be more efficient? Steele asked through the communication system. Sarah's voice came back clear and calm. General, direct correction teaches people to avoid specific mistakes. Analytical development teaches people to recognize and avoid categories of mistakes. The first approach creates followers who need constant supervision. The second creates leaders who can operate independently. The demonstration continued for 2 more hours, during which Steele observed training methodologies that were simultaneously more challenging and more supportive than anything he had ever implemented. The trainees were pushed to their limits, but in ways that built confidence and capability rather than fear and compliance. When the session concluded, Sarah joined Steele and Dr. Martinez in the observation room. General, what differences did you notice between what you observed and your current training approaches? Steele considered the question carefully before responding. Your methods seem to focus on developing thinking rather than obedience. You create situations where people have to solve problems independently rather than simply execute predetermined procedures. That's part of it. What else? You treat mistakes as learning opportunities rather than disciplinary problems. You seem to assume that people want to succeed rather than assuming they need to be forced to perform. Sarah nodded approvingly. Those observations show that you're beginning to understand the psychological foundations that make advanced training effective. People perform at higher levels when they feel competent and valued rather than when they feel threatened and controlled. Dr. Martinez consulted her notes. General, your evaluation results indicate that you have the cognitive flexibility and stress tolerance required for advancement to Phase 2 of the program. However, successful completion will require significant modification of your current leadership approach. She paused to let the implications sink in. The next phase involves 2 weeks of immersive training at a classified facility where you will work directly with advanced instructors and observe training methods that are classified at levels beyond your current clearance. You'll also participate in exercises designed to challenge your assumptions about authority, control, and human motivation. If I complete Phase 2 successfully, what would Phase 3 involve? Sarah answered this question. Phase 3 would require you to implement new training curricula at this facility, with success measured by objective improvements in graduate performance rather than subjective assessments of compliance. You would essentially be rebuilding your entire program using principles and methodologies that directly contradict your current approach. The scope of the challenge was daunting. Steele would be required to abandon everything he had built his career on and replace it with approaches that seemed to violate his most basic beliefs about military discipline and leadership. General, Dr. Martinez added, there's one more factor you should consider. If you advance to Phase 3 and successfully implement new training methodologies, your program would become a recruitment source for Operation Phantom Protocol. Some of your best graduates would be selected for advancement to classified training levels. You're saying that success would mean losing my best people to your program? Sarah smiled. We're saying that success would mean developing people who are capable of advancement to levels of service that most military personnel never have the opportunity to reach. General, would you rather command ordinary soldiers or develop extraordinary ones? The question crystallized the fundamental choice Steele was facing. He could maintain his current approach and continue producing competent but limited graduates, or he could embrace methodologies that would develop capabilities he was only beginning to understand. When would Phase 2 begin? He asked. Transport to the training facility is available tomorrow morning, Sarah replied. However, I want you to understand that once you enter that facility, you'll be exposed to information and capabilities that carry lifelong security obligations. You'll see things that will change your understanding of what's possible, and that knowledge can never be shared with anyone who doesn't have appropriate clearance. Dr. Martinez added her own caution. General, the psychological impact of exposure to advanced training methodologies can be substantial. Many people find that learning about extended human capabilities requires them to completely reconceptualize their understanding of reality. Are you prepared for that level of fundamental change? Steele looked out the window at his training grounds, where soldiers were conducting the same exercises he had been running for years, using the same methods that had seemed adequate until 3 days ago. Everything he saw now looked different, limited by assumptions he was only beginning to recognize. Dr. Martinez, Agent Chun, I've spent 30 years believing I understood military training and human capability. 3 days ago, I learned that my understanding was incomplete. If there's more to learn, if there are capabilities I haven't developed in myself or my people, then I need to know about them. He stood and faced them both directly. I'm ready for Phase 2. Sarah extended her hand in a gesture that seemed to carry significance beyond a simple handshake. General, welcome to the beginning of advanced human development. Tomorrow morning, you'll start discovering what you're actually capable of becoming. As they shook hands, Steele realized that he was crossing a threshold from which there would be no return. Everything familiar about his military career was about to change, replaced by possibilities he couldn't yet imagine. For the first time in decades, he felt the mixture of excitement and uncertainty that comes with genuine discovery. The man who had entered the evaluation process 3 days earlier as a conventional military commander was about to emerge as something entirely different. The question was what that transformation would reveal about his true potential. 6 months later, General Marcus Steele stood in the same briefing room where his transformation had begun, but everything about the space felt different. The furniture was the same, the windows looked out on the same training grounds, but his perspective on what was happening in that space had changed completely. The room was filled with personnel from multiple military branches and government agencies, all gathered to observe the graduation exercise for the first class of soldiers trained under his redesigned curriculum. These weren't just new graduates. They were proof of concept for training methodologies that had evolved far beyond anything Steele had imagined possible. Sarah Chan stood at the back of the room, no longer disguised as a communications officer, but present in her official capacity as a Phantom Protocol coordinator. She wore civilian clothes that somehow made her seem more formidable rather than less, and carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone whose authority was unquestioned because it was undeniable. The 2 weeks at the classified training facility had changed Steele in ways that were both subtle and profound. He had observed instructors whose capabilities seemed to transcend normal human limitations, participated in training exercises that challenged not just his physical and mental abilities, but his understanding of consciousness itself, and learned techniques for human development that most people would have dismissed as science fiction. More importantly, he had discovered that his own potential was far greater than 30 years of conventional training had suggested. The intimidation and control patterns that had defined his leadership style weren't just ineffective, they were actually inhibiting capabilities he hadn't known he possessed. Ladies and gentlemen, Steele began, addressing the assembled observers, what you're about to witness represents a fundamental evolution in military training methodology. These graduates have been developed using principles that treat human potential as unlimited rather than fixed, that view stress as an enhancement tool rather than an obstacle to overcome, and that measure success by capability development rather than compliance demonstration. The demonstration began with scenarios that would have been impossible for conventional military training to address effectively. Graduates were presented with complex situations requiring simultaneous tactical assessment, psychological manipulation, technical problem solving, and strategic thinking, all while maintaining perfect emotional control under extreme stress. What the observers witnessed challenged their assumptions about what properly trained personnel could accomplish. These soldiers didn't just follow procedures. They adapted dynamically to changing circumstances, developed innovative solutions to unprecedented problems, and demonstrated judgment that seemed to transcend their experience levels. Colonel Davidson, who had overseen the transition process, provided commentary as the exercises progressed. The psychological conditioning these graduates received doesn't just prepare them for known challenges. It develops cognitive flexibility that allows them to handle situations that no training program could specifically anticipate. One exercise required graduates to infiltrate a simulated hostile environment, gather intelligence on multiple objectives, and extract without being detected, all while maintaining cover identities that required them to demonstrate expertise in technical fields they had never studied. The complexity would have overwhelmed conventionally trained personnel, but these graduates adapted seamlessly to each new challenge. Sarah observed the demonstrations with professional satisfaction, but her primary focus was on General Steele himself. The transformation she had witnessed over the past 6 months represented exactly the kind of leadership evolution that Operation Phantom Protocol was designed to identify and develop. The man who had struck her in anger 6 months earlier had been replaced by someone who understood that true authority came from developing capabilities in others rather than controlling them through fear. Steele had learned to lead through inspiration and expertise rather than intimidation and rank, and the results were evident in every aspect of his graduate's performance. General Steele called out a visiting official from the Pentagon. These capabilities seem almost supernatural. How do we ensure that this training doesn't compromise military discipline and hierarchy? Steele smiled, recognizing the same concerns he had harbored before understanding what advanced training actually involved. Sir, what we've discovered is that true discipline comes from internal motivation rather than external control. These graduates are more disciplined than conventionally trained personnel precisely because they understand the reasons behind orders rather than simply fearing the consequences of disobedience. He gestured toward the ongoing demonstration, where a graduate was successfully managing multiple complex objectives simultaneously. Moreover, they're capable of operating independently in situations where traditional command structures are unavailable or ineffective. They can think strategically while executing tactically, which makes them far more valuable for advanced operations. The demonstration concluded with an exercise that showcased the graduate's ability to transition seamlessly between different operational roles. In the space of 30 minutes, the same individuals functioned as intelligence analysts, tactical operators, technical specialists, and diplomatic negotiators, adapting their personalities and capabilities to match each role requirement. As the observers filed out of the room, discussing what they had witnessed in terms that ranged from impressed to incredulous, Sarah approached General Steele. "Congratulations, General. Your graduates exceeded performance benchmarks in every category we measured. More importantly, they demonstrated the kind of adaptive capability that makes them candidates for advanced classification levels." Steele nodded, experiencing satisfaction that was deeper than any he had felt during his conventional military career. "Agent Shun, 6 months ago, I thought I understood what it meant to develop soldiers. Today I realized that I was just teaching people to follow instructions. What we've accomplished here is something completely different. What would you say is the most significant change in your approach?" Steele considered the question carefully. "I learned to stop trying to control people and started trying to develop them. Instead of creating followers who need constant supervision, we're creating leaders who can operate independently in any environment." Sarah smiled. That insight makes you eligible for the next level of program involvement if you're interested. What would that involve? Advanced instructor certification that would qualify you to train Phantom Protocol operatives directly. You would work with candidates who have already completed conventional military training and help develop them into the kind of deep cover operatives you've observed. The offer represented access to capabilities and responsibilities that Steele was only beginning to understand. Training Phantom Protocol operatives would mean working with individuals whose potential far exceeded that of conventional personnel, using methodologies that pushed human development to its absolute limits. There's something else you should know, Sarah continued. Operation Phantom Protocol has been authorized to expand, and we need experienced instructors who understand both conventional military training and advanced development principles. Your success here has identified you as a candidate for program leadership positions. Colonel Davidson joined their conversation as the room finally cleared of observers. General, I've received preliminary reports from all the evaluation teams. The consensus is that this training program represents a breakthrough in military personnel development. He consulted his notes before continuing. Pentagon leadership wants to discuss implementation of these methodologies across multiple training facilities. You're being asked to develop expansion protocols that could eventually transform how the entire military approaches personnel development. The scope of what was being offered was staggering. Steele had the opportunity to influence military training on a national scale, introducing methodologies that could fundamentally change how America developed its military personnel. Agent Shun, if I accept advancement to Phantom Protocol instructor positions, what would that mean for this program? It would mean training a new generation of instructors who could continue developing conventional military personnel while you focus on advanced operative development. You would essentially be creating a pipeline that transforms the most capable conventional graduates into candidates for classified operations. Sarah paused to let the implications sink in. General, what started as discipline for assaulting a federal agent has evolved into an opportunity to revolutionize military training for the entire country. The question is whether you're ready for that level of responsibility. Steele looked around the briefing room where his transformation had begun, remembering the man he had been 6 months earlier. That person had believed that strength came from intimidation, that leadership meant controlling others through fear, and that human potential was limited by conventional understanding. The man he had become understood that true strength came from developing strength in others, that real leadership meant creating leaders rather than followers, and that human potential was limited only by the imagination and courage to develop it fully. Agent Shun, 6 months ago I struck you because I was afraid of losing control. Today I understand that the only real control comes from helping others develop their own capabilities. If there are opportunities to continue that development at higher levels, then I'm ready to explore them. Sarah extended her hand again, but this time the gesture carried different significance. General, welcome to Operation Phantom Protocol. Your real training begins tomorrow. As they shook hands, Steele realized that everything he had accomplished over the past 6 months was just preparation for challenges he couldn't yet imagine. The briefing room that had witnessed his first encounter with advanced human capabilities would now become the launching point for his entry into a world where such capabilities were just the beginning. Colonel Davidson smiled as he watched the exchange. General, I have to ask, 6 months ago, when Agent Shun first demonstrated her capabilities, did you ever imagine that encounter would lead to this? Steele considered the question while looking out the window at training grounds where his new methodologies were being implemented with graduates who exceeded his former understanding of human potential. Colonel, 6 months ago, I thought I knew what was possible. Today I realized that what I thought was the limit was actually just the beginning. Tomorrow, I'll start learning what comes after the beginning. As the three of them left the briefing room, Steele felt the satisfaction that comes from discovering that transformation is possible at any stage of life, that assumptions can be challenged successfully, and that human potential truly is unlimited for those with the courage to develop it. The general who had begun this journey as a conventional military commander was ending it as something entirely different. A developer of human capability who understood that the greatest strength comes not from controlling others, but from helping them discover what they're truly capable of becoming. Behind them, the empty briefing room held the echoes of transformation that had changed not just one man's career, but his understanding of what human beings could accomplish when their potential was approached with wisdom, respect, and the recognition that every person contains capabilities waiting to be developed. The story that had begun with an act of violence had evolved into an example of how challenge and change can create opportunities for growth that exceed anything previously imagined. In a world where strength was too often measured by the ability to dominate others, General Marcus Steele had discovered that true power comes from the ability to develop extraordinary capabilities in oneself and others. That discovery would now influence military training for years to come, as the methodologies developed through his transformation became the foundation for developing the next generation of military personnel. The confrontation that had seemed like an ending had actually been a beginning, the first step in a journey that would ultimately change how America approached the development of human potential in service to national security. The transformation was complete, but the real work was just beginning.